All right, let's dive deep today. We're tackling climate change, but not just the science. We're going way beyond that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, into the moral stuff it brings up,
Interesting.
like a crash course on climate change, moral responsibility towards nature. That's the source material, by the way. We'll break it down and see how it, applies to you.
I like it.
So if you're prepping for a debate or writing a paper or just curious about, like, the deeper side of climate change beyond the headlines,
Yeah.
this is for you. Get ready for some big questions like, is climate change just a science problem? Or is there, like, a moral angle, too?
Okay.
Do we owe anything to future generations when it comes to the planet? And how much responsibility is on us versus, like, corporations or governments?
A lot to unpack there.
It is. It is.
The source material starts with the science, which is good, but quickly goes into some really fascinating ethical territory.
Yeah, it's not like, rehashing the greenhouse effect, although it does cover that.
Right.
It's more about using the science to show how everything's connected.
Yeah, it really stresses that climate change isn't this isolated thing.
Right.
It's woven in with our ecosystems, economies, even our social structures.
And it's not just like a slow warming trend either. The source material talks about these tipping points,
Oh, yeah.
these thresholds in the climate that, once they're crossed, can trigger irreversible changes.
Right.
It's kind of like we're playing Jenga with the planet's climate.
Exactly. And one example the source gives, which is, well, pretty chilling, is the melting permafrost.
Oh, right.
As it thaws, it releases methane, which is way more potent than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas.
Yeah.
So then that speeds up warming, creating this runaway train effect, basically.
Okay, that does sound scary. But what does permafrost, like in the Arctic, have to do with someone living in a city?
Well, that's where the interconnectedness comes in.
Okay.
Imagine as the permafrost thaws, it can make the ground unstable, right?
Uh-huh.
That can damage infrastructure, lead to more landslides, that kind of thing.
Wow.
But it goes even further. Melting permafrost pumps methane into the atmosphere globally, which then can worsen heat waves in urban areas, like you mentioned.
So even if you're not near melting permafrost, you could feel the effects.
Exactly. And the source really hammers that home. What happens in one part of the world can cascade onto ecosystems and us all over.
It's like the butterfly effect, but like planetary scale.
Yeah, good analogy. Now, beyond the science, the source really gets into the ethics of climate change.
Okay.
It puts two views against each other. Anthropocentrism, which is human-centered, and ecocentrism, which is nature-centered.
So anthropocentrism is like the human's first idea.
Yeah, pretty much. It sees nature mainly as a resource for us.
And ecocentrism is like flipping that, right? Nature has value just because it exists, not just for what it does for us.
Exactly. Imagine you're designing a city.
Okay.
An anthropocentric view would focus on human needs, buildings, transport, industry. Not much thought for the existing ecosystems.
Yeah.
But an ecocentric view would see the city as part of its natural surroundings, trying to balance human needs with keeping things ecologically sound.
Oh, that's helpful to picture it. So this anthropocentrism versus ecocentrism thing really gets at how we value the environment, huh?
Absolutely. And it connects to another big concept the source raises, intergenerational justice.
Okay, break that down for me.
It asks, do we have a moral duty to leave a planet that's livable for future generations?
Like, we're holding the planet in trust, not just for us, but for, like, everyone who comes after.
Precisely. If we keep going with unsustainable stuff, we're basically stealing from future generations, right?
Yeah.
Taking away a healthy planet from them. The source says we've got to think about the long-term consequences of what we do.
Throws a wrench into the live for today idea,
For sure. And the moral questions get even trickier when you think about global inequality.
Right. It's not just about the future. It's about how climate change is hitting people unevenly right now.
Exactly. The source points out how developing countries and marginalized communities get hit hardest by climate change.
But they're the ones who contributed least to the problem.
Exactly. So rising sea levels might displace people in Bangladesh while drought wrecks crop in Africa.
That makes sense.
And this brings up a crucial question. Who's morally responsible for fixing a problem they didn't mainly cause? Who should pay for adapting and fixing it?
Doesn't seem fair to expect those least responsible to bear the burden,
That's the ethical dilemma. And it's one the source says we can't ignore.
Feels like we're just scratching the surface here. We've got the science, these huge philosophical questions, and global inequality all tangled up in this climate change thing.
You're right, it's complex. And the source goes even deeper, looking at different levels of responsibility, individual, corporate, and governmental, and how they all connect.
So it's not just about me recycling or driving less. It's bigger than that.
Exactly. The source argues that while individual actions are important, they're not enough for a problem this big. We need systemic change, and that means looking closer at what corporations and governments are doing.
Okay, sounds like we're about to get into some serious ethical stuff here. Where do we even start untangling all this?
That's where it gets really interesting. The source says philosophy can give us tools to work through these moral dilemmas.
So it's not just science and politics, it's ethics and philosophy too.
Precisely, and it's not as abstract as it sounds. The source talks about different ethical frameworks that we can use to figure out our responsibilities and guide our actions.
Okay, that's pretty cool. So these ethical frameworks are like different lenses we can use to look at climate change, from different moral perspectives.
You got it. It's like we're equipping ourselves with a moral compass to navigate this tricky, challenging terrain.
This is really getting me thinking. It sounds like this source material isn't just giving us information, it's making us like grapple with our values and responsibilities when it comes to climate change.
Exactly. It's not just about understanding the science, it's about wrestling with the ethical side of it and figuring out what part we want to play in shaping a more, well, a just and sustainable future.
Well, this deep dive is already a wild ride. We've got the science of tipping points, the anthropocentrism versus ecocentrism debate, the moral issues of global inequality, and now we're adding ethical frameworks into the
You're
mix.
catching on quick, and it gets even more fascinating from here.
I can't wait.
So we talked about how individual actions alone can't solve this thing, but the source doesn't let us off the hook completely. It says we need to think about responsibility on different levels.
Okay, so how do we start figuring out those different levels?
Let's look at corporations, especially fossil fuel companies. They've been a big driver of climate change, right? So the source asks, do they have a moral obligation to go green, to switch to sustainable practices, maybe even make up for the damage they've done?
It makes you think about those companies that knew about the dangers of climate change way back, but like they downplayed it.
Yeah, exactly. It's a huge ethical dilemma. Some say these companies should be held accountable, maybe even pay for their part in this crisis. Others say, well, they were just doing what was legal and normal back then.
So it's about finding a balance between who's responsible for the past and how we move forward in a way that's good for everyone.
Right. And the source doesn't give easy answers. It lays out the moral complexities and just encourages us to think critically.
Okay, corporations have a role, but what about governments?
The source argues that governments have a moral duty to act on climate change, even when it's politically tough. I mean, they can make policies that can really change things, right?
Yeah.
Think about investing in renewable energy, regulating emissions, protecting communities that are vulnerable.
But politics can get messy. We all know that.
True, but the source reminds us that sometimes leaders need to make bold choices, even if they're not popular. Climate change means we've got to put the long-term well-being of the planet first, even if it shakes things up a bit.
So it's about holding our leaders accountable and pushing them to make climate action a top priority.
Exactly. And the source even says that we, as citizens, have a responsibility to be part of the political process. Speak up, push for policies that make sense for a sustainable future.
So we've got individuals, corporations, and governments all figuring out their roles in this climate thing. But you said earlier that philosophy can give us some guidance for making ethical choices in all this. How does that work?
Well, the source gets into these different ethical frameworks,
Okay.
like utilitarianism, deontological ethics, and virtue ethics. It's like having different tools in your ethics toolbox.
Okay, so let's break down these frameworks. How can they help us figure out the ethics of climate change?
Let's say there's a decision about building a new coal-fired power plant.
Okay.
A utilitarian approach would say, let's see how much happiness or harm this action would cause overall. It might say the short-term economic benefits are bigger than the long-term environmental costs.
So it's about weighing the costs and benefits for the most people.
Right. Now, deontological ethics is different. It's about moral duties and principles, no matter the consequences. So with the coal plant, it might say we have a duty to protect future generations from climate change, even if it means we lose some economic benefits now.
So it's about doing what's right, even if it's not easy or profitable.
Exactly. And then there's virtue ethics, which is about building good character. It might ask, what kind of person builds a coal plant knowing it could damage the environment? It encourages us to be compassionate, good stewards, and to think ahead when making choices that affect the environment.
So it's about doing things that match our values and trying to be better citizens of the planet.
You got it. It's not about finding one right answer, but thinking about different ethical views and making choices that fit our moral compass.
These frameworks are really helpful, but the source goes even further, right? It looks like the core of our relationship with nature.
You're right. It talks about the intrinsic value of nature. It's like moving past just using nature for our own needs and seeing that nature has moral standing on its own.
So it's saying a rainforest is valuable even if we don't get anything from it. It just deserves to exist.
Exactly. It's a radical idea, but it's at the heart of the deep ecology movement the source mentions. Deep ecology says we need a big change in values, moving away from just consuming and toward a deeper respect for how all life is connected.
So it's not just fixing the system, it's rethinking how we see the planet, realizing we're not separate from nature, but part of it.
Precisely. And that leads to ecological citizenship.
Okay, I've heard that term. What does it mean and how does it relate to climate change?
It's about broadening our responsibility. It's not just what we owe other people, but what we owe the planet.
So thinking globally and acting locally.
It's more than that. It's realizing we're all connected and what we do, even small things, can affect the whole world.
So like choosing local produce or supporting green businesses can help fight climate change globally.
Exactly. We're all part of a big system. The source says embracing ecological citizenship helps us move from feeling overwhelmed to realizing we can actually do something to make a fairer and more sustainable world.
Okay, starting to feel a bit more empowered, but climate change can still feel daunting. How do we stay hopeful with such a huge crisis?
A lot of people struggle with that, and the source doesn't pretend it's easy. It acknowledges things can look bleak, but it emphasizes that hope isn't about being naively optimistic or ignoring how serious things are.
So it's not about pretending everything will magically work out.
Right. The source says hope is about the possibility of change. It's realizing the future isn't set. Our choices, our actions can actually shape the world we'll live in.
So it's about focusing on what we can control even when things are chaotic and uncertain.
Exactly. The source argues that even small actions matter. When we join with others who share our values, we can make real change even when it seems impossible.
It's like that Margaret Mead quote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has."
That's it. We're not powerless. We can make choices that match our values and build a more sustainable and just world.
I think that's really important. We hear a lot about how bad climate change is, but this idea of hope as a possibility of change is empowering.
Absolutely. And that feeling can lead to action.
Okay, so we've talked about action, but what does that look like? What are some concrete things people can do to embrace this ecological citizenship and help build a more sustainable future?
That's the question. And the source encourages us to find what feels right for us. It doesn't give a list of rules because what's meaningful and doable is different for everyone.
So it's about finding our strengths and passions and figuring out how to use them to make a difference.
Exactly. For some people, it might be making conscious choices every day, like using less energy, choosing sustainable transport, or eating more plant-based foods.
Others might get involved in politics, support environmental groups, or use their creativity to spread awareness.
Right. The point is to find what speaks to you, what matches your values, and what feels like it makes a difference.
It's about realizing there's no one right way. Ecological citizenship is a journey, not a destination.
I like that. It's about always looking for ways to live in a way that shows we're connected to nature and that we're responsible for protecting it for now and the future.
This has been such a thought-provoking talk. We've gone from science to ethics to philosophy, and now concrete actions. We've covered a lot.
We have, and as we wrap up this part, I'm wondering, the source says a big shift in values is key for dealing with the climate crisis. What do you think are the most important values to develop in a world facing these challenges?
Whoa, that's a tough one. I mean, how do you even decide which values are the most important when we're dealing with like something as massive as climate change?
You're right, it's not easy. But the source does point to a few that seem really key: compassion, interconnectedness, and responsibility.
Okay, yeah, those sound good, but how do those actually connect to climate action, in the real world?
Well, let's start with compassion. The source makes this point that climate change isn't some abstract environmental problem, it's a human problem.
Yeah.
It's about the suffering that's already happening, because of climate impacts, the injustices that climate change makes worse, and the moral need to care for those hit hardest.
So recognizing that climate change has like a human face. It's not just numbers. It's real people dealing with drought, displacement, families struggling to get food because of extreme weather.
Exactly. And it's not just about those affected now. It's about feeling that compassion for future generations who, they'll inherit the consequences of what we do today.
Makes sense. So what about interconnectedness? How does that fit into addressing climate change?
The source talks about how all life on Earth is connected. The web of life idea. We're not separate from nature. We're part of it. What we do affects not just us, but like ecosystems and communities around the world.
So it's realizing that what I do, even in my own small space, can actually have effects globally, like driving a gas guzzler or buying things that aren't sustainable, that might be contributing to someone suffering across the world.
Exactly. And it's not just the bad stuff. Interconnectedness also means that good actions can have big ripple effects too. The things we do to reduce our impact, support good practices, or speak up for change, those can create positive changes that go way beyond what we see immediately.
So interconnectedness is like a reminder to see ourselves as part of this global system, to act in a way that benefits the whole thing, not just us.
Right on. And that takes us to responsibility. The source argues that we all have a responsibility to act on climate change, not just governments or corporations.
Yeah.
It's about understanding that we have the power to make choices, choices that reflect our values and help create a fairer, more sustainable world.
But it can feel like what I do is so small compared to the problem, like just a drop in the bucket. How do you deal with feeling powerless, but also knowing you have to do something?
I get that, it's a real feeling, but the source says that every big movement, every major change in history, started with people who believed a different world was possible.
Yeah.
It's realizing that our choices, even small ones, add up to a collective effort that can actually make a difference.
So it's about both doing things myself and also being part of something bigger.
Exactly. Think of a mosaic. Each action is like a little tile, and when we combine our efforts with people who share our values, well, we create this amazing picture of a better world.
I like that. It goes back to that idea of ecological citizenship. We're all in this together, and each of us has a part to play in shaping the future.
Absolutely. And that feeling of shared responsibility can be really powerful. Instead of being overwhelmed, we can focus on what we can control: our choices, our actions, and how we contribute to the bigger effort.
This whole conversation has been so insightful. We've covered the science, the ethics, the philosophy, and now individual action and collective power. It's been a lot to take in, but I feel like I understand the ethics of climate change so much better.
You sure? It's been a great discussion. And I think the source really pushes us to move past all the doom and gloom and, well, embrace the possibility of change.
So it's not just about the problems, it's also about the solutions, what we can do, and how things can change for the better.
Right. And that's where hope comes in. Not being naive, but a realistic hope that sees the challenges, but also believes in our ability to innovate, be compassionate, and act together.
Grounded hope, I like that. It's not about ignoring the reality of climate change, but believing that we can make a better future.
Exactly. And that belief can drive action. It can push us to make different choices, to expect more from our leaders, to support groups working on solutions, and to inspire others to join the movement for a more just and sustainable world.
Well, I think that wraps up our deep dive into the ethics of climate change. What a journey.
It's been great exploring these complex issues with you.
Before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one last thought. This whole conversation has shown us that the future isn't already decided. We have the power to choose what kind of world we want to live in.
So as you go about your day, ask yourself, what choices can I make, even small ones, that line up with my values and contribute to a world that is more just, sustainable, and compassionate? What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind?
That's a really powerful question. And on that note, we'll let you continue your own exploration of the ethics of climate change. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep making choices that make a difference.